Over to you, Mike.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good morning to everyone. So yes, this is the fourth of our series of webinars, this time on nature-based solutions to help people adapt to climate change. And it is indeed a joint effort by Sarah, Simon Duffield, who you'll hear later, and myself. And just in case this is the first of these you've been to, this is the fourth in a series of webinars introducing climate change and how we can mitigate it and adapt to it, particularly within the context of the conservation and environmental management world. So it's open to Natural England staff, but also staff working in our many partner organisations. And it's great that we've had a really good, diverse group of people joining us each time. So we've already been through the impacts of climate change, how we can adapt to help nature conservation in a changing climate, and also last time looking particularly at how we can increase carbon storage and sequestration by ecosystems. That was the nature-based solutions for net zero talk. And now we're moving on to think a little bit more about the topic of adaptation and how we can reduce risks to people in a changing climate. This is the outline. I'm going to start off with some introductory ideas and then look a little bit more around catchments and coasts, which are key for climate change adaptation. Sarah is going to talk about the urban environment, and we're going to devote quite a lot of time to that because it's something that we often overlook, I think, those of us who work within the natural environment, within the conservation sector. But it's really important, and it comes into very sharp focus in the context of vulnerability to climate change. And then Simon's going to go on to talk about some of the challenges of how we implement nature-based solutions in practice before we come to the end. And yet, just to say one more time, sorry you can't just speak up. There's too many of you on the call for that. But do please use the chat facility to ask any questions, and we'll answer them best we can at the end. We're also going to produce a question and answer document, which will pull together the questions from across the 4 different webinars that we've had and answer some of the ones that need a little bit more time than we can give it on the day. So think about some of the issues then that we're dealing with as an introduction. And I've said this several times now, but the way we respond to climate change, it really has 2 different elements. And within the climate change world, we tend to talk about mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation in this context is about reducing climate change itself, reducing emissions and sequestering more carbon, for example, in trees. And that's essential, but it's not enough because we already have climate change. We can see it really clearly happening. We're already suffering the impact, so we need to adapt. We need to reduce vulnerability and adjust to changes that are already happening or that we can't prevent in the medium term. And the focus of today is in that space on adaptation. And this is a slightly more detailed definition of climate change adaptation, the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate change and its effects. In human systems, adaptation seeks to moderate or avoid harm or exploit beneficial opportunities, and in natural systems, human intervention can facilitate the adjustment to expected climate change and its effects. And I think we'll see actually that in talking about nature-based solutions for people, we start to blur the lines between the human and the natural. And that's one of the themes I hope will come through as we go on. So this term nature-based solutions, it's become really very fashionable. And it's something that a lot of different people can latch on to and find as a helpful framework. The more formal definition of a nature-based solution is actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And I've highlighted that, human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So to be a true nature-based solution, it's good for people and it's good for nature. And just to introduce a term you may come across if you get deeper into the literature on nature-based solutions and related ideas. One of ecosystem-based adaptation is actually an older term that's quite commonly used, particularly in international discussions. And it's worth saying, of course, that nature-based solutions cuts across a wide range of different topics. It's not just about climate change, it is used more widely, but recently it has come to be largely about adaptation and mitigation, at least in policy debates. Now, I want to think a little bit about risks before we go any further. And in the UK, we know quite a lot about the risks that climate change poses to people and to the natural environment. The last systematic assessment across the country as a whole was published in 2017, the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment. And that's quite a detailed series of risks that are identified. But there were 6 headline risks that were identified of different magnitudes and different degrees to which they're imminent now or need to be taken into account in the future. One of those 6 risks explicitly deals with the natural environment, termed risks to natural capital, including terrestrial, coastal, marine and freshwater ecosystems, soils and biodiversity. And, you know, to a nature conservationist, an ecologist like me, that's the comfort space. That's where we've always worked, and we're pleased to see it there, because no doubt it is at risk. But if you look a little bit more carefully at all of the other risks, all of these other 6 priority risks, there is an environmental component to all of them. So the risk of flooding. Floodwater doesn't just come out of the blue, it comes off the land, down the river, off the sea. Food supply is grown in the natural environment. Public water supply, almost the same as flooding, really. It's coming from the same places. The natural environment is intimately part of all of these risks. And so the risks to people from climate change are almost always mediated through their environment. And I think that's an essential starting point for everything we're going to say today, because it does mean that if we are going to try and reduce the risks to people, it will involve working with the natural environment, not solely, but as an important element. So I'm going to talk a little bit about catchments and coasts, because water is a key element. If you cast your mind back to our earlier webinars, you remember that one of the key changes in climate that we're seeing is a change in rainfall patterns, a trend towards drier summers and wetter winters is something that consistently comes out in climate change models, but also more variability and particularly heavier rainfall events happening when they happen. The warmer air stores more moisture in it. When it rains harder with a greater risk of flooding. And so one of the key issues for ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions looking forward is natural flood management. And historically, a lot of flood management was around the way you built sea defences or walls to prevent flooding along rivers, or drainage and dredging and so on. But there's increasing evidence that actually there's some really good solutions that involve managing the natural environment better. So, for example, restoring and creating wetlands, creating flood storage areas, places where water can safely accumulate during a flood event, improving soil health and infiltration so that water goes into the soil better, doesn't just run straight off the land surface. Creating woodland. Woodland is good for slowing the flow of water physically over the landscape. It also helps to make it easier for water to infiltrate into the soil. It can have an effect in increasing evapotranspiration rates, the rate of loss of water into the atmosphere. And then also, if it's beside a watercourse, wood falling into streams can help to slow the flow. A lot of flood risk management is about slowing the flow of water down so that you don't get a very high peak of water rushing off the hillside during a storm event. And then finally, renaturalising water courses, which again helps to slow the flow. And I'm going to talk through just a few examples to illustrate that, particularly in the rural environment. But I would say when we're looking at catchments, for example, the urban and the rural are intimately linked. Sarah will say more about the urban, but I just thought I'd start with a particularly spectacular example that actually my colleague Simon, who you'll hear from in a minute, has visited in the Netherlands near Groningen, where there's a really very large nature reserve that's been developed, 2,500 hectares of wetlands and so on next to the city, and providing space where water can safely accumulate during a flood period, but also not just simply a flood storage, but actually creating a wetland system with great benefit for nature conservation and for recreation as well. Here in the UK, we're getting increasing amounts of experience of renaturalising stream channels, and this is an example from the Lake District, Swindale Beck, which I visited a few years ago, where what was once a straightened river course has been put back to the natural meanders, which slow the flow again. Good for the biodiversity of the stream, including fish spawning in there in the sort of shallow areas, but also slowing the flow up. It's worth saying, I think, that with some of these issues, it does depend where a river or a stream is relative to settlement as to whether some of this slowing the flow approach really is a good idea or not. Because obviously at times over the past few years, a lot of interesting dredging with the hope, I guess, of water flowing away more quickly away from a vulnerable settlement. And of course, that you can see in a few cases that will be sensible. But on the other hand, if you think what's upriver from a settlement, actually you don't want to speed the flow down into it. You actually want to slow it up, to slow the water from going into the settlement. So where it's going to have most impact on people will differ depending where you are in the catchment. And Swindale Beck is a long way upstream from settlement. Woodland creation, the picture on the left here is a plan for creating scrub and woodland around the T-Bay area in the North Pennines beside the M6, actually. If you're used to driving up that way, you can see a very large woodland creation scheme going there. And one of its many benefits, as well as for biodiversity and so on, it is for slowing the flow of water off the hillside into the rivers and reducing flood risk. A lot of interest too in this concept of debris dams, some of them created naturally by wood falling in from a tree, but also sometimes artificially created as during the slowing the flow project. One of the forerunners up in Pickering in Yorkshire. Now, all these are fine as individual measures, but where they have most benefit is where a whole catchment approach is taken. And one of the best examples for me is something the National Trust has been doing on their Hornicote estate in Somerset on the fringes of Exmoor. And that's involved a whole series of different interventions, including creating flood storage areas, including slowing the flow in rivers, and it all adds up to something that's really been very successful in preventing flooding for people. And I can't resist but show their latest project, which is to reintroduce beavers there. And of course, creating woody debris dams is on the job description for being a beaver, and clearly there's a lot of interest these days in what potential there might be for beavers as part of a rewilding approach to improving flood risk management. Now, moving on from flood risk to talk about drought risk briefly. And this is a much less of a work topic, but with hotter, drier summers, we are at greater drought risk than we have been in the past. And some of the things we might do to reduce drought risk are quite interestingly similar to those we would do for reducing flood risk. So improving infiltration, holding more water in the land, basically holding water back in the catchment with wetland restoration and renaturalising watercourses rather than sending it in a straight line to the sea. How far will that take us? Some way, but we also need to reduce the amount of water we take out in the course of abstraction from wetlands. Well, flooding is not just an issue inland. There's also the issue of coastal flooding. Rising sea levels are a threat to people as well, of course, particularly during storm surges. It's not that we don't have an issue at first, but the higher sea level compounds that. But coastal habitats, salt marsh and sand dunes and so on, can provide a buffer to absorb some of the force of a storm surge, but they are at threat of being squeezed between the sea and hard sea defences. So managed realignment, actually removing some of those artificial sea defences or setting them back further inland, can help to restore that natural flood defence function. So this is an early example in Alkborough in the Humber Estuary, where some more natural intertidal habitats were created back in 2007. But it's gone on to be really quite a well-developed set of techniques, and one of the most sophisticated is here with the RSPB's reserve on Wallasey Island in the Thames Estuary area. And they're becoming increasingly common in different parts of the country. Great benefits for the habitats and species they support, and in terms of reducing flood risk as well. Well, I'm coming to the end of my section now, but I do also just want to mention briefly that it isn't just about flood and drought. There is also the potential for natural cooling effects from improving the naturalness, if you like, of river systems, and a lot of interest in natural cooling of streams, so-called keeping rivers cool approach, by planting trees beside them or allowing them to regrow naturally. Good for the wildlife, but also good for fisheries, salmon and trout fisheries particularly, where the species are vulnerable to high temperatures. So that's an introduction to some of the watery aspects of nature-based solutions for adaptation. I'm going to hand on now to Sarah, who's going to take us into the urban environment for the next 15 to 20 minutes probably.
Thanks, Mike.
Over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we know how important it is to think about the urban environment because the world is becoming increasingly urbanized. The UN figures for 2018 show us at 55% of the global population living in urban areas, and that's projected to be 68% by 2050. As this slide shows here, in England, urban areas house 83% of us, and where there are millions of new homes planned to be built, huge growth areas, new towns. So, it's really important to make sure that we bring in urban nature-based solutions to draw people and nature together. Urbanization in itself can degrade our natural environment, but we know that the design of our urban areas can be much better, and we have mechanisms at our disposal to deliver better design. Biodiversity itself has a crucial role in making our landscapes in the urban areas livable, and the idea that nature-based solutions create successful places to live is becoming increasingly understood and recognized, and it's moving up the policy agenda. And it's really seen as something that's an essential component of thriving, future-proof places. But as I said, the current state and design of much of our urban areas does leave little room for biodiversity and natural functioning systems. And climate change really sort of brings an extra challenge to that, and we need to think about how we assess our vulnerability and adapt to climate change. The map on this slide is a map of vulnerability of habitats to climate change for the London area. And you can see there are natural habitats, semi-natural habitats in the urban area, but the red colouring shows that they're much more vulnerable than some of the larger areas of habitat outside of that. I'm going to talk a lot about green infrastructure, biodiversity conservation and nature-based solutions and their role in urban areas to create more sustainable, suitable areas for us to survive and live in climate change. Next slide, please, Mike. So as we've talked about, climate change will impact the urban population in a number of ways: flooding, drought, the urban heat island, particularly the urban heat island in urban areas, increasing the impact of heat waves. And as I've said, the natural environment in an urban situation is degraded, and climate change will just exacerbate the current issues that the urban areas face with that loss of natural processes, and extreme events that are already larger in urban areas will be exacerbated by climate change. But we do have nature-based solutions as a way to deliver better places for people to live in. Next slide, please. But biodiversity does exist in urban areas, and it will also be affected by climate change. So much like the effects that we see across areas outside of the urban, biodiversity will experience shifts in range, changes in population, changes in phenological responses. But the urban areas, as I've said, already are degraded, limited habitat for species, and the built-up areas fragmenting networks and providing blockages to movement of climate change, movement of species to respond to climate change. So biodiversity conservation in urban areas that thinks about the people that live in urban areas, it can be multifunctional, multi-beneficial. But what we do have to think about is a different way, a different mindset perhaps. Our traditional framework for habitats and sites might not always fit in an urban area, and it's better to consider urban areas as having a range of different kinds of habitats and functions that reflect the physical and the cultural environment. And this combination of land use types that exist within urban areas can actually be pretty biodiverse and pretty heterogeneous. So we need to think about that idea of a matrix of habitats, maybe the smaller stuff outside the larger green and blue spaces that provide valuable nature conservation and provide that matrix to deliver a range of functions. Next slide, please. So we do have some resources to help us do this, and we've got our newly published Climate Change Adaptation Manual. This sets out evidence and information on how nature-based solutions can provide adaptation, and this is within our green infrastructure section. So I might use the term green infrastructure and nature-based solutions interchangeably here. They're very much related to each other. So the green infrastructure section in this manual takes us through the causes and consequences of climate change within urban areas, looks at both the impacts on urban biodiversity and urban human populations, and gives us information about how green infrastructure can help us adapt. And that is through the green infrastructure being able to help us manage temperatures, water supplies, manage flooding and surface water issues, as well as helping species adapt and reducing soil erosion. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take us through a series of examples of where green infrastructure can help, starting with the urban heat island. So the issue here is that the urban environment, through the high buildings, complex topography, artificial surfaces, areas of limited vegetation, all lead to the urban environment trapping and storing heat at a greater rate than the surrounding countryside. That heat is re-emitted overnight, keeping temperatures unnaturally high in these areas of greater urban design. The map here, the two maps here, the one on the top right, they show an example of how this works. So this is a photo of London a thermal photo of London in June 2011, where this is an overnight photo. The red areas are really, really high temperatures. The green areas, much lower temperatures. There's a couple of places, so if you look at the West End there, the densely built up areas around there, 31 degrees centigrade, in comparison to an area down in the kind of southwest area, which is Richmond Park, much, much cooler at 23 degrees Celsius. And when you look at the vegetation map underneath, you can see that the areas of much cooler temperatures correspond with the areas of much larger green and blue spaces. So that's really an example of how nature-based solutions, green infrastructure can work to help mitigate the urban heat island effect. So there's lots of different types of urban green infrastructure that can help to do this. Tree planting and green and blue spaces provide shade, evapotranspiration, cooler microclimates. They also shield the buildings and street surfaces that draw in the heat to reduce that re-emission of heat overnight. So they can create cooling as well in the local area through air temperatures being moved around, so creating breezes and drafts within urban areas. Green roofs and walls also provide cooling benefits. They can reduce the need for air conditioning, they can shield the building facades again, and create a wide range of added benefits too. So we'll come on to green roofs and walls and their flood management benefits, but also they reduce pollution and can be a biodiversity enhancement too. Next slide, please. So moving on to flooding. There are many impacts of flooding in urban areas. Pretty obvious stuff, really, but there can be high costs and disruption associated with urban flooding, both in residential and business areas, but also in recreational areas too. It can also affect our transport and energy infrastructure, and that can have a knock-on impact, reducing our service provision, emergency services, schools, hospitals, and we can see at the moment how that kind of reduction in service provision is having a huge impact on us. But even more pointedly, it can have an impact on our health and our lives, so injuries, mental health impacts, and also impacts on drinking water provision, etc. So well-designed nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, can provide flood management services to enable us to adapt better in urban situations to climate change. And they can do this through reconnecting rivers with their floodplains in some instances, but really importantly, reducing runoff and slowing the rate of flow of floodwaters. That's a very important part of this, as well as directing and storing water temporarily so that it can slowly make its way back into the urban environment. Again, greater, wider biodiversity and landscape amenity benefits can come from all the kinds of green infrastructure that we can design in urban areas. And some elements of green infrastructure include things like sustainable drainage systems, green roofs, as we've mentioned, the provision of wetlands, even in small confined spaces, but also street trees, parks and gardens. Next slide, please. Just to give a couple of examples on how various different elements of green infrastructure can provide flood benefits. Just to talk through a couple of examples of sustainable drainage systems. SUDs, as they're called, aim to mimic natural processes. They try to intercept water close to the source rather than allowing it to run off the landscape. So it allows the water to infiltrate into the ground or be retained into storage areas in order to reduce flood risk. They can also help remove pollution from that runoff too. So this table here, there's a lot of detail here, but it's just to show, and this is only a snapshot of a table really, that there are a range of different techniques to help us with this water harvesting, infiltration, conveyance, storage and treatment of water. And, these include larger wetlands, smaller swales, things that are very, very small on a very local site-based approach, which could include permeable pavements or rain gardens and filter strips, and then, of course, green roofs as well. So they can be, SUDs in particular, can be important in areas where there are a high number of minor developments, such as our kind of paved and impermeable driveways that we often have in our homes. And the cumulative impact of such developments has not really been considered, so smaller interventions can really potentially add up to quite a lot of benefits for this kind of issue. So if we move on to the next slide, this is to talk through briefly a wetland restoration case study. It's really important to know that we can do these kinds of interventions. We can deliver nature-based solutions, or rather green infrastructure, in different ways. And this is two different examples of how we can do that. So we can actually focus on establishing a wetland that provides a number of different functions. And this example in the top right here is a case study from Beam Parklands. It used to be a single function flood storage reservoir, but some works were carried out to turn it into something much more multifunctional and future-proof. So the flood infrastructure that was supporting homes and employment sites in the area now also provides high-quality habitats, recreation area for the local community, on top of that flood storage element that was provided before. The picture on the left-hand side is a single issue, single sort of function green space. And this can be delivered under the banner of green infrastructure, but we know that we can do it better, and we know that we can provide this multifunctional approach. So making sure that we have the right thing in the right location with the right connections and the right functions and services for the local people is really important. And we can do this. We have examples, as you can see. So next slide, please. To move on to green roofs and their ability to help us with flooding alongside other things. So green roof, something that's partially or completely covered with vegetation, sometimes with some mineral substrates as well. They can be intensive roofs, and you can use them for formal spaces, actually spaces that you can access and get some recreational use out of for food growing, for example. But they can also be extensive, which are more naturalistic and can support a range of different wildflowers. There are lots of different ways of creating a green roof. But one of the functions that they provide is a conventional roof. The rain, when it falls onto the roof, it rushes off quickly and moves rapidly towards drains. Green roofs avoid this by absorbing the water. The vegetation helps to slow, retain the water. At least some of it will evaporate back into the atmosphere, helping across that broad range of functions, helping to reduce the peak flows, and also providing something nice for biodiversity and potentially for people as well. You can combine a green roof with renewable energy installations too, such as solar panels, and they can also provide other benefits, such as providing insulation for the building, habitat for wildlife, as we've said, and a more aesthetically pleasing environment. And we know that there's evidence is mentioned in the adaptation manual that green roofs are designed to provide a more heterogeneous wildlife habitat, can perform as well or even better at water attenuation than less diverse vegetated roofs. So this idea of multifunctionality and the ability for biodiversity to create or to provide many different functions is really supported by this evidence. Next slide, please. So it's important we think about how we put this all into practice. And as we've talked about in previous webinars, scale is really, really important, and we need to make sure that we work across a range of different scales and a coherent range of scales too. So they're all linked together. So, for example, at the national level, we need a really coherent spatial plan that allows us to put in place adaptation for people and for nature recovery. We need to move down to the regional scale as well, use that landscape scale level to provide the large-scale connections and address nature-based solutions across that landscape scale, as Mike has mentioned, at the coastal areas and catchments, but the urban area has to fit within that regional matrix as well. Then we move down to the local scale, where we need to really think about the particular issues that have to be addressed. So localized flood issues, potential renaturalisation of river channels, and providing the access that's necessary for people in those areas. But not to forget the site level as well. So really small interventions. When I talked about the SUDs, they can add up to provide a better cumulative benefit in an area where you don't have a great deal of space for huge, interventions. Next slide, please. So just to also say that the design is really important. So making sure that we choose the right location to provide these green spaces and particular adaptation features. The designing in the right features to address the issues that are concerned in that particular area is really important. So thinking about whether you can reinstate a natural process, mimic something that biodiversity provides or even needs. The feature that you're designing needs to be applicable to the location that you're in. We also, multifunctionality, we've all mentioned it a number of times now, is the absolute cornerstone of effective and sustainable nature-based solutions or green infrastructure. it's really important in these small areas, in busy urban areas, that we need to provide a range of different benefits to address a range of different things, so that it's important that it meets the needs of the people that live there. And really important too, the element of partnership. Most successful and most important green infrastructure is often delivered through a range of different partnerships, organisations, and that means that we can reflect the diverse needs in an area, as well as help to engage a wide audience through that partnership approach. Important to mention, adaptation to climate change requires adaptive management. We need to make sure that we look at that monitor the impacts of the nature-based solution that's put in place, and monitor and review and see whether we need to make changes. And maintenance is also crucial. You need to look after the adaptation elements, the green infrastructure, to make sure it's continuously doing the job it was designed for. So next slide. Really, in short, we just think this is from the Green Infrastructure Guidelines from Natural England. Why would we design something like this when, next slide please, we can design something like this? So using the space in a better way. We know it's limited, but we need to think about using it in a better, more multifunctional way. Last couple of slides from me, a couple of case studies. So next slide please. At the regional level, we're all aware of the Olympics in 2012, but it was also a really big green infrastructure project. This is a regional level because it's sort of in the context of the Lee Valley Regional Park. It's that green corridor stretching out to the north of London there, and the Olympic Park fits within a part of that. The vulnerability map is here again, looking at the vulnerability of habitats. You can see the Lee Valley Regional Park there, and why it's important to have nature restored in these areas. So we know it was the centrepiece of the Olympic and Paralympic Games, with a major regeneration project in East London. And it does provide a wide range of access and recreation in line with that long-term legacy of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. But it also provides a wide range of other benefits, particularly flood protection. It floods intentionally, which means that it protects thousands of homes in the area. Millions of people have visited since its reopening in 2013, and there's an awful lot of biodiversity been recorded in the area, including 92 plant species, 28 spider species, including a new record for Britain. So, and that is an area where in the past, previous to this, contact with nature was very lacking in this particular area. So really, and this has also been achieved through a huge range of partner organisations to provide these multiple benefits. So next slide, please. This last example here is about the site level. So we've jumped right down to the site level from that regional level. This is the Victoria Business Improvement District, or BID, in central London. And a BID is an area which geographically defined where businesses make financial contributions and decide how to spend that contribution on projects in the areas determined by the local business community. Here, the aim was to retrofit the area covered with green infrastructure to deliver a range of services, particularly around surface water flooding. But they wanted to use natural environment features to better create a sense of place for the people that live and work in the area. So one of the things they did was create a green infrastructure audit to identify suitable roofs for green roofs and different types of roofs. And when they mapped the potential area of roofs, this isn't delivered, but it's potential, it would increase the green space cover by 25 hectares, which is the equivalent of St James's Park, which is nearby and a very large and well-used area of green space in London. So in this case, the idea is that those small, well-planned interventions can add up to quite a large increased level of biodiversity as well as flood protection. And last slide for me now, just to note that there are huge values in creating nature-based solutions, green infrastructure in urban areas for people and for biodiversity. But one of those is the economic contribution. So this slide shows some figures about how money, millions of pounds have been saved in terms of productivity, avoided aircon costs, removal of air pollution, removal of carbon from the atmosphere, noise reduction, and recreation provision. And when you bring that together with the other values of that nature provides for people, it just reminds us how crucial nature is as our life support system, and even more so due to climate change. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody. What I've been asked to talk about really is around the issues around delivering MBS and some of the challenges that we face. So you've heard about the multiple benefits, both for society and the natural world, but we still have a tendency, and I know the situation is changing over the last couple of years, but when there is an extreme weather event, for example, a flood or a wildfire, there is a tendency to revert back to the tried and tested approaches, largely engineered solutions. MBS very rarely comes to the fore at that stage. It is usually only thought about when Plan A, the traditional approaches, are deemed to have failed or likely to fail. Like I said, this, I hope, is a bit of a historic view in that some of the narrative around the winter floods this year were very much more around natural responses, catchment scale responses. But it's still definite risk that, especially at the reactive short-term scale, nature-based solutions do not come to the fore. So why is this? Well, we've been working with a few of our partner conservation agencies across Europe under the Nature Network, really to have a look to see whether there's any generic challenges out there and to try and then think about what the possible ways of overcoming those are to make sure that nature-based solutions go from, Plan B to Plan A. And I'll just highlight a couple of them very, very briefly. So next slide, please, Mike. So the first one is, what's in a name? Now, MBS can mean different things to different people, and that can be a problem. It's an umbrella term. You've heard ecosystem-based adaptation. In the UK, green infrastructure is used to cover them. Add things such as climate change buffers to it as well. So it's a broad concept with scales and shades within it. It also talking about the need for multiple engagement across stakeholders. And if you put those two together, what you'll find is that people come into this from a very, very different background and have a very, very different understanding about what MBS actually means. So I'll just highlight this through the pictures that you can see in front of you. They all fall within the remit of a nature-based solution. But the one on the left is very much around greening traditional seawall defences. So these are all designed to resolve an adaptation issue around coastal flooding. So the left, very much greening the grey. The right, very much a conservation, natural environment approach around managed realignment. They all nature-based solutions, but of course, if you're talking to stakeholders, different sectors will come in from a very, very different understanding. So a key point is when you're designing and thinking about nature-based approaches, we need to have a real clarity of message at the onset so everybody knows what we're talking about. Okay, Mike, next one, please. Now, the other thing, again, which has been talked about is that nature-based solutions nearly always have multiple benefits and multiple beneficiaries. So this here is just an example from a workshop we did at DEFRA very recently, looking at the multiple benefits and impacts of the restoration of salt marsh. Salt marsh restoration designed to ameliorate coastal flooding, but the benefits are wide and diverse that go way beyond that simple core, that core objective. Now this, of course, is both a strength in that these accrued multiple benefits are one of the reasons why nature-based approaches should be taken forward above alternatives. But it can also be a weakness when it comes to trying to get these approaches adopted. And there's several reasons for this. I'll just highlight a couple of them. So not just in the UK, but across Europe, the response to extreme weather events, for example, flooding, wildfire, is often quite siloed in terms of the organisations and the stakeholders involved, so quite a narrow stakeholder suite. The benefits often accrue outside the remit of those organisations and those stakeholders, so they are not the beneficiaries of some of the broader benefits. And this also goes through to some of the national versus local, in that we have national and regional strategies that promote adaptation through nature-based approaches, but the actual action, the intervention, happens at a very local scale on the ground. So again, in both cases, what you find is that the stakeholders who are both responsible for resolving the issue and the actors involved in doing it are not the full beneficiaries of some of these multiple benefits. So they fall outside the remit of those organisations and sectors. So again, clear solution is that we need to have a full understanding of the multiple benefits. But going back to what you've heard from Sarah and Mike, nature-based solutions require partnerships. We need to bring in the partners that are impacted and benefit from some of these wider impacts. Okay, Mike, next one, please. Now, we've already just touched on the need for a narrative when you're setting up a nature-based solution, a nature-based approach, but we also need a similar narrative around what you might expect coming out of the other end. Now, the natural environment, inherently complex, the response of the natural world to climate change, highly variable in some cases and uncertain, and therefore some of this variability needs to be reflected in terms of the narrative around some of the outcomes. We often talk about shades and gradation of response from a natural system. This, of course, is a high strength in that it makes it far more resilient to catastrophic failure, for example, if you might compare that to a hard engineered response. But we're talking shades of grey, we are talking variability compared to a much more black and white solution that the traditional methods might have presented. We just need to highlight that. We need to have a clear narrative around risk and ambition at the onset. Mike, next one, please. And the other one, and the last one I just really touch on, and some of what, many of us on the call work in the conservation sector. We work in land management. So for us, this is quite an obvious thought process. But an NBS, nature-based solution, isn't a single action. It will need aftercare and management. It's variable. So, the nature-based solution on the left around urban trees, obviously one that needs a high level of management and the associated skill set that comes with it. Some of the more rewilding examples, either on the coast and in the uplands, might require less aftercare and management. But even with those, most of them require particular management if you want to get the maximised benefits for biodiversity. In terms of adoption of the approach, again, going back to stakeholders' understanding and skills and their skill sets, many of these aftercare skills and needs are not found in the organisations that traditionally were involved in delivering these responses. So again, we keep coming back to the need for partnership working to bring in the appropriate skill set, not only the beneficiaries, but also the partners, the stakeholders necessary to deliver some of this aftercare and post-management. Mike, next one, please. So that's really all I had to say. It was a bit of a cameo today, but really to reinforce and highlight the need for early and comprehensive stakeholder engagement. We need people to fully understand the narrative around what we're trying to achieve, how we're going to achieve it, and the likely outcomes. And we've not really touched on this, but the multiple beneficiaries, of course, need to be picked up and accounted for. And this is where things like natural capital accounting, ecosystem approach come to the fore. But we need to capture these multiple benefits to help a enable this narrative and inform stakeholder engagement. But the key strength of that nature-based solutions, and something we should be pushing, is that it is a proactive response. As Mike's highlighted, the challenge of climate change is only going to get worse, and this is a very proactive way of responding to do it. The complexity, the breadth, the need of stakeholders mean it shouldn't really ever be a natural reactive response. To achieve this, multiple times we've said it, multiple benefits, multiple stakeholders, therefore partnership working absolutely key and fundamental to get this adopted. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're wrapping up now. Just a quick reminder, if you did have any questions, put them in the chat. We'll only have time for a couple probably, but do that. So we're all aware, I'm sure, that actually our land, our seas, our rivers, our lakes, there's multiple demands that people make on them, and adapting to climate change is just another on top of all that great list of things they need to do for us. So how are we going to do this? Well, I want to hark back to something we looked at last time. Change is coming. This is a moment of change. If we're going to meet the commitments to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, change in land use particularly is on the agenda. Something like 22% of agricultural land converted to forests, peatlands or biofuels. And that's the scenario from the Committee on Climate Change. So change is coming, and I think it's how we manage that change, not just as a single issue change, but actually something that does give multiple benefits. One example is the Nature Recovery Network, which is an initiative Natural England's intimately involved in setting up in England, working with the government. And this is all about really providing a framework to see where we can recover nature, restore the species and habitats that we've lost. And it's not just about protection, it's going into recovery. And that opens up lots of potential to build in climate change adaptation and mitigation into that. It's often said that the climate crisis and the nature crisis are two sides of the same coin. You can't tackle one without tackling the other. So we need to make sure that adaptation and mitigation are writ large in that. And also that it's people and nature as part of it. We've talked about the adaptation manual a lot. We've also mentioned a little the Nature Networks Evidence Handbook, another tool which does factor in people as well, in how we build a network for nature's recovery. So it's a key opportunity to do this in a strategic way. But I want to come back just to this slide I showed at the start. And it's not a pretty slide, and it's not a pretty topic. You know, we do face serious risks. Our children and grandchildren, even more so. And I hope we've talked a bit today just to flag up how this isn't a problem or compartmentalised problems for the natural environment and for people. Actually, there's an intimate link between the risks to people and the risks to nature, and therefore we do need an integrated, intimately linked solution, which is what nature-based solutions aim to be if we're really going to effectively tackle this set of risks. And I just want to come back, you know, there is a challenge here to our community, you know, given that most of us, I think, do work in the natural environment, conservation, environmental management. There's a challenge to us. You know, we're not just about protecting the scraps anymore, I hope, but looking to a wider recovery and also addressing a wider range of problems, human as well as natural, and doing it in a joined-up way. And that I think, is the big vision. It's a big risk, but there's a big vision, and that will take us into challenging new areas, including working with professionals in different areas, including being more open, perhaps, and more proactive about some of the economic benefits, which, you know, is really important at the moment, in gaining traction with what will be a very difficult recovery from the coronavirus situation. We have to be providing for people and making the sums add up, not just in terms of our own income and expenditure, but in terms of wider society and putting nature in there. So my final slide then, some conclusions. Nature-based solutions can reduce climate change risks to people. It's relevant across the rural, the urban and marine environments. And we probably should stop distinguishing in a way between rural and urban, even though we've done it today. They are joined up. Implementation depends on good partnerships, including with local communities. And the biggest gains will come when we join up the solutions for resilience, net zero, and nature recovery. And I'm going to stop at that point. And Sarah, have we got any quick questions?
Yeah, we'll spend the last 5 minutes going through some of the questions that have come in on the chat, and there has been some really interesting ones that have, provide some challenges, which is interesting. So firstly, we have a question that's come in about green roofs combined with renewable energy installations, and the fact that the caller has seen planning applications refused because saying that people can't do green roofs as well as solar panels. And this is an interesting point. From what I've seen, and I was under the impression that they could be combined. I've not heard of refusals so far, but it does show us, a potential challenge around multifunctionality and bringing things together. For me, I was thinking that, or from what I've seen, it's the design focusing on only incorporating one element as opposed to it being refused particularly. But I'd be really grateful to hear more about this, about your experience on this one, perhaps after the call, if you wouldn't mind getting in touch. Because we do need to work on standards with regard to that. And within Naturalising, then we are working on green infrastructure standards that will be coming to fruition relatively soon, and we'll be providing climate change input to that. But we're also starting out quite a big period of work with our planning colleagues to help us produce responses to various things like this. And these are the challenges and the questions we're going to have to answer. So, yeah, it's all really interesting to hear that, and would love to hear a bit more about that experience so that we can see the role that we can play. Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions, or a couple of points from Isabel as well coming in about the fact that green roofs can provide water, grey water usage, basically. So you can channel the water from a green roof or even from a grey roof into a grey water tank so that you can use that within your toilet flush, in washing machines and various things. So, yeah, good point. That's another multifunctional part of green infrastructure. But also, I was talking about this on the line before you all joined, the management and maintenance of road verges and street verges, parks and gardens, this sort of incessant need to tidy them up all the time. We do need to think culturally about our green spaces, and perhaps we can leave them alone a little bit and maybe save some money there. A really important thing that Katie got in touch with me privately to talk about was social problems and urban greening. And again, this is not something that you think about immediately, but the idea that increasing property prices come when you increase the green space in a local community, and therefore potentially push out that local community. Gentrification. We know about that in urban areas, and it's not something that is particularly welcomed by the local community, of course. But what we do see is that a lot of deprived areas can be the least green, and people in those areas deserve green spaces for a better quality of life, for a range of different issues. So it's clearly a complex issue. And Katie very kindly shared some of the research that's gone on with that. So I'll make sure that we include that we're going to write a frequently asked questions type document to cover some of the questions that have been put to us over the series of climate change webinars, because we can't get to everything. So I'll share that. But it's, again, an example of the complexity, maybe unintended consequences. But we do have to address this, because we can't leave places, not very nice and not very green just because we don't want to push people out. They deserve a good quality of life. We all do, wherever we live. Something, perhaps lastly, from Chris about the economic benefits of the potential for the growth and of increasing capacity in nature-based solutions delivery. So, increasing the labour force and the resource that we have to train and employ a large number of people in this kind of skilled work in order to provide nature-based solutions. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important place to increase the training, increase people working in this area, and allow us to monitor and manage these green spaces as well. I'm sorry that we haven't got to all of your questions, but we will send around that document and all of the recordings. These will be shared on YouTube, so we'll send around the recordings and the document to everybody that's been involved or hasn't made it to some of these webinars. Do you want to say a final word, Mike?
No, thank you for joining us. We will hope to run this series again as well in June, I think is worth saying, but we'll put that up on Eventbrite, assuming we go ahead with that. So, if you wanted to be able to ask some questions or direct people to that, then that's another chance. But do look at the YouTube channel. The first 3 are up, and this one will be up shortly.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.